Hi, this is Paul. It's been almost 2 years since the Jordan Peterson Sam Harris debates. And part of the advantage of time is perspective. I'm not one of these geniuses that hears something and completely grasps it right away and can articulate it. It takes me time to learn, and over these last 2+ years, I've been doing a lot of thinking and working and talking and listening and trying to learn. A little later this week, I'm going to have a conversation with Ron Dart. Ron Dart was the editor of this book. We had one conversation about this book so far. At this point, the conversations flow where they will, but we're going to talk about Jordan Peterson and Roger Scruton. And so I re-listened to the Peterson Scruton video, and that kind of sent me back to the Peterson Harris videos, because I often get the question, well, what does Jordan want? What does Jordan Peterson want to do? What really is the essential aspect of what he wanted to accomplish in that first wave? And I think the heart of Jordan is to know how to live. That's what he's looking for. And actually, at the beginning of the Dublin talk, I think Sam Harris quite nicely laid out what their common project was, and in the scope of this video, we'll show where they diverge. Now, I'm going to do this video as two videos. There's going to be a long version that has a lot of clips in it, and there's going to be a short version that has maybe only one or two clips in it. And I do that because some of you want short videos and some of you want long videos. So I'm going to attempt to do that. So this is the beginning of the third debate, and here Sam sort of sets the stage, and I think he pretty much gets this right. And as we develop this, we'll see where the two really differ. And
Jordan, and I should say that though much of our conversation together will often sound like we're debating, we'll definitely, none of us are in the habit of pulling our punches. There's an immense amount of goodwill here, and it's true on stage, it's true off stage, and we're all trying to refine our beliefs together in conversation. So none of us view this as a debate, though we might stridently disagree about one thing or another. So what Jordan, I think, disagrees with me about, I think he's worried that we clearly have a common project. We're both concerned to understand how to live lives worth living.
okay, so there's their common project. They're both concerned to live lives worth living. Now, you'll notice that's, how do you measure that? How do you measure a life worth living? And Sam has an idea that somehow rationality as is a guide to well-being, and rational agents can determine and guide their lives towards well-being. For Peterson, the image is a bit more complex.
How can we do this individually? And how can we build societies that safeguard this project for millions of people attempting to do this in their diverse ways? And so many questions immediately come online when you try to do that. But what is the relationship between facts and values, for instance, or science and spiritual experience, or ethical lives? And we have, as for the moment, differing answers to those questions. Jordan is...
Okay, and then he goes from there. But that's where I wanted to begin. So how can we make life worth living, and how can we develop systems and structures and societies where as many people as possible can live lives worth living, or we might say meaningful lives? Now, of course, Jordan's story, if you go back to Maps of Meaning, the first lecture, the 2017 was the last one that he did, his story begins with trauma and fascination for totalitarian regimes. He grew up in the Cold War, and he wanted to answer the question why these two civilizations would put the entire life as we know it in the entire world at risk of nuclear annihilation over ideological differences. Why would the Cold War, a difference of ideology, risk bringing the world to the brink of nuclear annihilation? And he was also fascinated by, so again, having life be worth living, these different regimes, Nazi Germany, Soviet Union, Democratic West, we can throw in the Islamic countries, although the rise of these neo-Islamic countries is quite a bit newer, because of course the old Ottoman Empire falls at the end of the First World War, and there's a reformulation, and of course later in the 20th century a new arrangement for the ideas of how an Islamic country, what an Islamic country would be. But all of those countries, all of those systems are asking questions about how can we as individuals, as communities, live lives worth living. And so Peterson very much dug into those ideas and worked through them, and that of course is his work, Maps of Meaning. How did totalitarian governments thrive in the 20th century and then fall, and why? And of course his eyes are from a young man growing up in Farview, Alberta. I think it's Farview or Fairview, I don't remember. Alberta. And his father, his parents are educators. He gets involved as a young man in politics very quickly. His undergrad is political science, and he very quickly turns to psychology. Now, here's the thing about human beings. Human beings are not simply the product of evolution. And I've often used the example of this alligator named Goliath that is in a gator farm in southern Florida. I remember visiting there with my children, and I'd see all of these gators just sitting in these pools, and I basically asked the guy there, don't they get bored? Because I know, if you have a dog, I had Rottweilers at the time, those dogs get bored. They can get destructive because they got to chew. They're busy. And the guy says, no, they're pretty dumb. As long as you throw chicken at them, they'll sit there in this warm water and eat and grow and multiply. We human beings are not like that. And I think as Brett Weinstein said with his conversation with Alistair McGrath that I've played a number of times, and I'll play it in the clip video. I won't play it in the non-clip video. Human beings are heirs of two lines of inherited information. There's the genetic information that is carried via the DNA, and then there's the cultural information. And Brett, I think, says quite aptly and correctly that for human beings, those two strands are necessary to produce a human being. And as Brett says, they're at the far end of a continuum. So I know already the frustration I have with having the short version and the long version of the video is because I thought the commentary that I just made on this video that I've looked at I don't know how many times was really good commentary. So if you want to see it, you have to actually watch both videos. But anyway, the point here is that human beings have two tracks. And just to summarize some of the points I made on the commentary section, which if you're watching the shorter video you don't see, is what happens with human beings is that we have to inherit so much information, more information than we are consciously aware of. But we inherit so much information, and that information has to be compressed into enormously tight cultural bundles, only a tiny fraction of which we have the time in our lives to be conscious of. But so much of it is encoded within us, and my example of that is between the age of your first draft of parenting is the parenting you received, but you don't know it. And if you were to sit down, let's say you're having problems parenting, and you go down and you sit down with a therapist, and the therapist says, okay, write down everything you know about parenting. And maybe you could spend an hour doing it. The therapist would say, that's nothing like everything you know. Keep going back. And let's say you spent days and weeks working on everything you knew about parenting. You'd go back and you continue to do a therapy, and what you would discover is that you continue to realize things you knew that you didn't know you knew. Because and all of this is built in, and so much of it, Sam Harris's rationality wants to imagine that we can set this out propositionally and then we can manipulate it, but so much of the information is encoded in action and behaviors, and it's processed by intuition and feeling that there's far more information there than we can possibly have time in our instantaneous little lives to process. So your 2-year-old throws a temper tantrum, and then you think, okay, what you do is you react to it. And you don't know why you react to it. But all of the stuff that is built into that reaction has been encoded to you from a myriad of information that you have effortlessly absorbed that you don't even know you have. And that's what a human being is. Okay? And if you want the long version of that, see the other. Now, what happens, however, with human beings is that these two streams are tightly intertwined. They are not discrete. We keep talking nature and nurture, but we have absolutely no idea in real life how they're separated. And again, something like marriage or parenting, something where, okay, your child throws a temper tantrum and you have an emotional reaction to this. And then you have an instinctive response that before you consciously or rationally have time to respond to your temper tantrum, boom, you do something. Tim Keller has this great story about when one of his children was young. They were at a park in New York City, and the kid was climbing up the slide, and he was down at the other end waiting to receive the kid, and the kid starts falling off the ladder of the slide, and Tim Keller says, before I knew it, I was around the slide and I caught the kid. And his wife, who was there, was like looking at him like, how did you do that? Tim Keller's not, he'll tell you himself, he's not an athletic guy, he's a bookworm. But people have these experiences where it's like, it was coded into me and I didn't know how. Now, is that biology or is that culture? And you can't differentiate or distinguish these two things. So these two streams are not discrete. And over huge expanses of time, they have intersected and evolved. The values are selected for in the mating process. Because multiple values compete, they lay themselves out in hierarchies, and these get passed on down via agentic, this is another word I picked up from the Weinstein brothers, agentic sexual inheritance. So I'm going to play a clip from one of the Peterson-Sam Harris debates here. So these streams get crossed and they get built in, and there's no, the streams are not discrete, and there's no way to pull this apart. Now, what this produces in us is this a priori structure. And if you look at especially the two Vancouver talks where Brett Weinstein was there, and it comes up in the other ones too. What Peterson keeps trying to address is that Sam Harris imagines we can operate in the world sort of pulling everything out as propositional truths, rationally manipulating them. Well, let's even give actions and behaviors, rationally manipulating these actions and behaviors, and then simply changing them. And what Peterson says is that there's far too much information, and so what we actually have is a sorting mechanism. And this sorting mechanism, just because of the two strings, is built within us structurally, because what happens is you have the hardware and the software, and it becomes so much software, the software begins to rebuild the hardware, and back and forth and back and forth. Again, that's why we don't have the barrel chest of the chimpanzee, because the software of culture and cooking reprogrammed the hardware, so now we have less intestine than a chimpanzee, and we don't have the enzymes that break down the leaves and things that the chimpanzees and the cows are eating, and instead we outsource that to cooking. The structures are so built within us, and that's just digestion. We're not even talking the unbelievable mental capacity that we possess, because and if you read I was reading this interesting book about comparing human intelligence to chimps, and it was kind of like, well, how much smarter are we really than chimps? It's all the software, it's all the communal processing, it's that capacity built in with, I forget, at one point Peterson talks about how many of our receptors are inhibitors, which means that the crazy things about chimps is they have no impulse control. And I'll tell you, in terms as I work with addicts and homeless people and just there's very successful people in society, impulse control is a huge problem with us, okay? With human beings. And, we're impulsive. And sometimes being impulsive pays off. Often being an impulsive really is a problem. And so impulse control is a huge thing. Be able to weigh and measure. In fact, impulse control is behind this entire salvific narrative of rationality that Sam Harris wants to put forward, because impulse control means waiting and testing my intuitions and using data. So the heart of the Vancouver One talk was, because these structures are so within us, we are blind to them and their impact. They are cultural, psychological, and biological. And the longest running self-conscious conversation, individual and communal, attempts to hack these, and they're fundamentally religious. That is, in fact, the great compression schemes that take this enormous world and boil it down into stories and systems that we can actually work on. And you'll find Jordan Peterson, both when he's talking to the Ayn Rand people in that one conversation with Dave Rubin, and other places, noting that when he's working with people who are deeply troubled by, let's say, post-traumatic stress, and I had this talking to Sevilla King when we talked about this time, people can't change until they get down to the theological level. Why? Because the theological is the level at which the compression schemes get so tight that there's so much information that's boiled down to them. And it's at that level that we can actually, the data sets are small enough that we can actually work on them, but they're tied all the way out. And I would say philosophy is a sort of a similar thing like that. All right. Now I think I have a clip that I want to play with this one too. So at the end of Vancouver 1, Peterson says, and if you go back to my earlier commentary, Peterson keeps trying to say, Sam, there's this a priori structure that's been built into us. It's deeply within us. It's analogous to the fact that, I'm making this, not Peterson, you could learn a language or multiple languages growing up effortlessly. And in a sense, again, my words, not Jordan's, what Sam's advocating is that the real path to mastery of this world is the kind of direct, rational approach of trying to learn a foreign language in high school or college and never actually going to the country and being immersed in it. We're going to learn it rationally. Here's the grammar, here are the nouns, here are the verbs, make some vocab cards. Is that really the best way to learn a language? It isn't. Sam Harris comes along and he's just dismissive. Poor Jordan never really gets, I don't think, a competent conversation partner in this, because Sam just keeps hitting his allergic reaction. It's sort of like if you were married to someone that had been traumatized as a child about dogs. You could never go anywhere where there was a mention of a dog, because every time a dog would come around, the show is over because there's a dog. There's a dog. There's a dog. And it's like, well, can we go to Yosemite? There might be a dog if we go on vacation. Can we go to this hotel? Do they allow dogs? I mean, that's what trying to have a conversation with Sam Harris is like with these things. Because any mention of religion or a holy book or anything like this, I mean, Sam is like someone who's been bit by a dog. And anytime you get near a dog, the difficulty is that it's almost impossible to go around and have a dog-free life or a child-free life. So he's dismissive, and in my view, he's astoundingly naive about human beings. He's like the serial divorcee not being able to figure out why he or she has such bad luck finding a soulmate. The same issues keep cropping up in these relationships. Wonder where they come from. I think I have another video clip that demonstrates this. Yeah. So Jordan's trying to walk through this with Sam, and Sam just can't see it. And that's when we get to this clip that, again, I've played many times. Okay, so Jordan, what is God? Well, what if that entire world too big boiled down into an a priori structure where the software comes back around to the hardware and it has an agentic force in our world, and the compression scheme JPEG basically religion is the JPEG of a too large world. All right, that's what I said on the clip. If you had a name for this, what would it be? Well, spirits and well, what if it was a totalizing thing? What if it were beyond just agents and actors and spirits of war and anger and sexual attraction and all of those things? How could you conceptualize it as an agent and arena together? Well, God number one as the arena, God number two as the agent, and Sam only sees God number two. And I'm going to play this clip again. So this is where Jordan basically says you've got God is all of these things built into us. And Sam hears that and says, what about the anti-masturbation? And Brett smiles because Brett understands Jordan here, but Sam doesn't get it. There's two different meanings of God, and I think, and this is why Jordan keeps talking about God psychologically. There's an image. So God number two. There's room for God number two, but the ontology of God number two, Jordan. That's where Jordan kind of draws his line and says that I'm not going to go there. I'm trying to stay within this box here, and so the resurrection, because that's suddenly where the resurrection, where things start getting a little, well, what are the limits of this? And that's how Jordan keeps answering the resurrection question. Now, God number one way of conceptualizing the long development of the a priori structure is the idea of God, and that's the best word. That's the compression. That's the compression we need in order to actually live well in the universe, and why we keep defaulting to it and using other words like universe or great spirit or something like that, because we can't help but actually manage ourselves within this very rich context without these ideas. It's the sum of biological and willful agency through time. Its values colonizing biology. It's represented in stories passed along and refined in Darwinian fashion. And you can hear Jordan make these points in both the Transliminal series, or some of the best interviews that Jordan did, Jordan with another Jordan. Now, and this is where we begin to get into some of the videos that I've been doing over the last 6 months, where we talk about the meta-divine realm versus the Hebrew God, because the scientific vision approaches the world as if there are no norms. And Peterson points that out in the Transliminal, because we take the norms out. And where was I reading? Did I have that on a video? Did I have that in one of my conversations? Oh yeah, it was in my conversation with Lars, the Swede, where we talked about trolls, where Odin, you take out one of Odin's eyes so that he can have power over the world. And that's in a sense exactly what we do with the scientific vision, is we take out the eye of the manifest vision to gain a certain amount of power and mastery. We get rid of the normative in order to have a monarchical, two-dimensional vision of the world in order to gain power over it. But our biological cultural hybrid history is, of course, full of value agents colonizing blind objects. Okay? We see and respond to the agency of the arena. And so I'm taking the Vervaeke agent arena, and of course the Hebrews conceptualize, and this is where, again, every time these celebrity atheists talk about God as Woden or Zeus, and I think Peterson actually gets it wrong here too, because Peterson should read Kaufman. Jordan, if you're listening, I'm doing a Freddy here, read this book. Because what the Hebrews do is God is no longer, and look at my conversations with Brett Sockold, God is not in the system. God is the arena who writes himself into the story. And again, the analogy, it's not a perfect analogy, I know, but how could Frodo find Tolkien? Can Frodo find J.R.R. Tolkien anywhere in Middle-earth? Not going to find him in Isengard, not going to find him in Mordor, not going to find him in Minas Tirith, but Tolkien is everywhere. And then the Dorothy Sayers illustration that Tim Keller uses often. Dorothy Sayers, friend of Tolkien and Lewis. Dorothy Sayers so loves her books, and Dorothy Sayers in that sense is the arena. She creates the arena, and then she writes herself into the story. And that's in a sense what happens with Christianity. That you find this in the Old Testament with the angel of the Lord coming into the story and being an actor. So even in the Old Testament, the Father isn't merely the arena, and it's certainly not pantheism, because the arena does not exhaust God, just like Dorothy Sayers' books does not exhaust Dorothy Sayers, and J.R.R. Tolkien's Middle-earth does not exhaust Tolkien. Now back to the fact-value distinction. A pile of facts does not a value make. That's the difference between the manifest and the scientific image. But values have been colonizing the facts we see for a very long time. And there are layers built into both the divorcee and the institution of marriage that few are cognizant of. There are layers built into us as parents. Again, as language acquirers. All of this stuff is built in. So you have the fact-value distinction, which is a really helpful distinction, but the values have been colonizing the facts for a very long time, and that has been built into us. Now when you get into Peterson and Scruton, I didn't make a link, or did I make a link here? Well, I better check it out. Now this is, of course, Peterson later, and I would have preferred Jordan to not spend so much time on the culture war stuff. But he gets there honestly, because competence is this capacity stalking the conversation with Sam Harris and stalking the end of history stuff that Brett and Eric Weinstein are putting out is the question of the good. And Sam Harris just always simply assumes the good. And Jordan Peterson basically calls him on it at one point because Sam Harris wants to say love and rationality. And Jordan says, you just basically took Christianity. And again, go back and look at some of the John Gray videos that I did about, the videos about John Gray and Tom Holland and assuming Christianity. So when Jordan here talks with Roger Scruton about basically competence versus tyranny, it's the idea that the universe is such a thing that there's not a zero-sum game. So I'll play the clip. And so God, in his alignment with competence, means that the God revealed by the system is one that cares for the flourishing of the little creatures. And now, again, Christians assert this is a broken world. It's not functioning as it should. And the reason it's not functioning as it should is human responsibility. Okay? That gets really complicated. I'm not going to go off into that. Now, then Scruton and Peterson will go into the question of are received institutions so corrupted that zero-sum relationships are impossible. And this is where you get into the relationality, because the relationship between the customer and the plumber is both use power, that the customer uses the power built into, let's say, the money that is going to be exchanged to the plumber for the service, and the plumber uses the competence and the glory of a well-functioning drain in exchange for that. And it's not a zero-sum relationship. And Peterson then in that video then goes into talk about the fact that let's say human relationships between each other, friendships or marriages, are not zero sum. They are costly and they always bear the mark of sacrifice, yet they also bear the mark of glory, that they can be win-win. And it's not just simply a loss and exchange. And in fact, that then gets built into kind of the sacramental aspect of human sexuality, where it's self-donation, high risk, vulnerable, and then life-giving and bonding at the same time. Now they complain, and Sam Harris would be right there with them, that children of the serial divorcees blame the institution and the opposite sex and the sexual rivals in general, and they look to burn down the house, but burning down the house does not a better shelter make. Now, I wasn't able to find the clip, but in the 4 talks, there's one moment in which Peterson makes absolutely plain the fact that as a psychologist, as a clinical psychologist, what he had noted is that when we don't have a fully integrated system, we don't function optimally. And I think about C.S. Lewis's The Discarded Image. And whereas there's certainly, and Lewis fesses up to this in his book, The Discarded Image, there certainly were, we cannot go back to the medieval model, but the medieval model was so rich in meaning giving. And what the book I have on the screen here, George Marsden's The Soul of the American University, the subtitle of it is From Protestant Establishment to Established Non-Belief. What happens in this long process, and of course Charles Taylor writes about it, it's the meaning crisis. C.S. Lewis writes about it. This has been going on for hundreds of years, where we've been systematically dismantling the system to bring us to a point where someone like Sam Harris would say, oh, well, being is obvious and we pursue it rationally, and here's love and that should be the system. And it's like, well, why is love at the top of the hierarchy? Tom Holland would say, because Jesus put it there, Sam. And you're not going to divorce that from Christianity. You can't, there's no need to smuggle Jesus in. And in fact, Peterson tags him on this and says, Sam, I don't need to smuggle Jesus in, because you did it when you smuggle in love at the top of the hierarchy. And so what we've seen in the West is the long divorce of the church from society. And in many questions, rightfully so, because Sam has a point about tyranny and when the church becomes tyrannical. But in some ways, ironically, the social justice warriors that Sam is complaining about are in many ways in bed with Sam in terms of this allergic reaction and suspicion of all institutions. A unified and integrated view of knowledge that includes God. Because again, if you look at God as broadly as Jordan Peterson, well, you can't, the only thing you can do is no longer use God for the God number 1 stuff and try to divorce God number 2 from the equation. And that's exactly what Harris does. And in many ways, Marsden's book is the story of that. And even though we still call them professors, what do you suspect they were professing? Again, read Marsden's book and you'll see the story of it. Is the decline of the humanities that Scruton and Peterson will note simply the logical conclusion to this process? God number 1 has been renamed and deism has taken over, and God number 2 divorced. So first you deconstruct and you split God number 1 from God number 2. That really happens in deism. So we can begin to manipulate, and that's a long, slow process, but to the degree that when Jordan Peterson reads, Jordan, what do you mean by God? And he starts reading these things. And Sam Harris, it isn't recognizable to Sam or how many people that Jordan is talking about what all of the ancients understood to be God. So you deconstruction of God number 1 and the exile of God number 2. The value question still haunts. What is good? How can we know it? How can we walk through a cornfield? Sam says, you can find your way, but ironically, not much different from use the force, Luke. It's just natural to know what the good is. Is it really? And again, Brett tags him on this often, as does Douglas Murray, but Sam's practice is dog and react. And then he carts out his usual arguments. And again, my plea is, well, I'd like to see Jordan get well and take his time at it, and be refreshed and rested, and then look for better conversation partners. Because what Jordan so clearly wants to do in these conversations is get down to the devil in the details, as he keeps saying, but Sam won't play that game with Jordan. Sam basically says it's obvious how to get through the cornfield. And Jordan Peterson says, from an evolutionary perspective, you need all the help you can get. And so that's why we talk to the ancients. Well, we'll see if this works as a short version and a long version. I don't know that it necessarily worked. This has been pretty long. I'll have to do a little cutting and pasting to get in it. So I'll put this out tomorrow, and let me know what you think about the long and the short versions of it. I don't know if that really works. Maybe my short versions have to be a whole lot shorter, and this other process that I'm playing with doesn't really work. But anyway, thanks for watching. Hope it was helpful.